Welcome everyone to the Teacher Baker Maker how-to video of how to make a three-dimensional birth announcement. So the frame that I'm using is a 9" by 9" frame, but the actual visible area is 8.5" by 8.5". So I'm going to start off by making a square on my Design Space canvas. So I already opened up Design Space, I clicked on New Project, and that's what brought me to here. So the reason why I'm putting the square here is it's going to give me the parameters of how large I can actually make my object. So I'm going to go to Shapes and then Square. And you'll see that it inserts a square that's a little bit over 3" by 3". Now I want my square to be 8 3/4". The visible area is 8.5", but I want to make sure that my cardstock on that bottom layer goes slightly larger than what's visible, so that way it's kind of tucked under the actual frame. So to do that, I can go up here to where it says size, and I'm going to change this to 8.75, and if I hit tab, it automatically changes the dimensions to 8.75 on the height as well. Now, since I'm going to be using white cardstock, just to make it easier, I'm going to go up here to where it says line type. I'm going to click on this dark gray square, and instead I'm going to choose the white. So now I have my white square on my canvas, and I can drag it up here to the corner, so that way I can see that it is 8 3/4" by 8 3/4". Okay, next, the center feature of my design is going to be that 7-layered hot air balloon. So I have to upload that picture. Now, what I did is I had actually purchased that SVG from designbundles.net, and I saved it to my hard drive. I then uploaded it into Design Space, so it's already here. So since I want this in my design, I'm going to click on it, and then I'm going to click on Insert Images. Okay, and you'll see here it is. So I can use my mouse to drag it around. Now, I don't necessarily want it to be this big. I can shrink it down a little bit, so that way it's more manageable with the size of the canvas. I'm just going to shrink down my whole screen. So where it says 100% in the corner, I'm going to hit the minus sign, and that way I can see my entire background at once. And again, I could play around with this to make it bigger or smaller depending on how I want it to fit into my picture. Then I also want to have some clouds in my picture. So to do that, I can go to Upload. And this was a free clip art that I downloaded from svgclipart.com, and I'll put the link for that in the blog. So I already downloaded it onto my hard drive. I uploaded it into Design Space. Now I'm going to choose it and insert the image. Now you'll see it starts out as a gigantic cloud. I definitely don't want a cloud that big. So I am going to shrink down my canvas a little bit just so I can see a little bit more of this. And again, this is way bigger than I need it to be. I'm going to keep shrinking and shrinking. Until I get it to be the size that looks in proportion to my hot air balloon. And I'll just enlarge my canvas again. There we go. Okay, so again, I can play around with that to be the size that I want. So let's say I want it to be approximately that size. And then I'm going to want it to be the same size over here. So to do that, I can just right click, duplicate, and now I have a matching blue cloud over here. Now I want this to be three-dimensional as well. So I'm also going to duplicate it again. I'm going to turn this one white just so that it's easier to see when I layer it. And I'm going to shrink this one down a little bit so that way when I layer it on top of the blue one, it will have that three-dimensional effect. And again, I'm going to duplicate this one so that way it matches over on this size like so. Now I want to insert some text here. I want to insert the baby's name and date of birth on this cloud that's on the left. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to drag this down for a second. I'm going to click on text. Actually, I don't want his name there. Let's just do date of birth. So let's do July 17th, 2020, 10:22 p.m. Okay, now this font obviously is way too big. It's not really the font that I want, but I do want it centered, so I can do that now. Alignment center. Then I'm going to go over here to font. I'm going to go to system, because these are the fonts that I have on my computer. I don't need to pay for these because I already have these on my computer. And I am going to look for a font that's called KB Stick to the Plan. That's this one. Okay, so you can see now that it has changed to the font I want. So now I can shrink that down until it fits onto the white cloud the way I want it to. There we go. Okay, now I want this to be a print then cut. And the reason why I'm doing that is I don't want each little individual black letter to print out as a separate teeny tiny piece of cardstock. I want it to print directly onto the white cloud. Okay, now I want these to print instead of cut. So I am going to highlight my text up here instead of line type cut. I can keep that as cut, but for fill, I'm going to change it to print. I'm going to do the same thing for the cloud. I'm going to print. Now I'm going to select both the cloud as well as the text. So there's the text. I'm going to hold down my shift button and also select the white cloud. I am then going to flatten those two objects together. And now I can drag it up onto that cloud. So now it'll print the white cloud and the text on my regular laser printer. And then I can take that sheet and put it in my Cricut to cut it out. Now I'm going to repeat the process over here with this cloud, except this time for the text, I am going to put down his weight and his length. Now notice it already has it as KB Stick to the Plan, but I want to shrink that down and I want to center it. There we go. So keep shrinking until it's about that same size. Let's see. There we go. It fits on the cloud. Okay. It looks like perhaps it's a little bit bigger than the other one. Okay, there we go. So now I am going to highlight the text, hit shift and also select, highlight the text, and I want to change it to a print first. Same thing with the cloud. I want to select the cloud, change that to a print, then go back and highlight the text and the cloud, flatten, and then drag it up. Okay, so now we have that all set. Now I want to be able to drag my blue and white layers of the clouds around. So I want to now attach those together. So now I'm going to select, I'll select the white cloud as well as the blue cloud. And I am going to attach those together. So that way I can drag them around and they're all attached together. I'm going to repeat that process over here. Select the white cloud, hit shift and the blue cloud, attach, and now those can be brought around together. Okay, so I have my clouds. I have my balloon. Next, I want to insert his name on a pennant. So to do that, I know that Cricut Design Space has a free pennant image. So I'm going over here to images. I know it's called a pennant. Now I only want the free one. So for ownership, click the plus and choose free because it's going to show me lots and lots of ones that you have to pay about 99 cents for the image. I don't want to do that when they have a perfectly nice free one. Now, I liked this one, and I'm not sure if you can see that it has little slits in it because that's going to help me figure out where to place the holes that I want in each pennant because I want to thread actual twine through it. So rather than have to poke holes myself, I'll let the Cricut do it for me. So I'm going to choose this though as my free image and then click Insert Image. And you're going to see it inserts it rather large. So I'm going to resize this down. I want it to be, let's see. Let's see, I can also do it up here. 1.369. Okay, there we go. Now, I don't want it to be pink because I'm actually going to be printing it out in blue. I'm going to use like the darkest blue of what's already in my design. So I'm just going to choose that. So that way it can actually cut it out on the same piece of cardstock. Or I can choose, any of the shades of blue that are here. It doesn't necessarily have to be this blue. If I want to choose something lighter, something darker, I could. Okay, so that's the size I want. That's the color I want. And I'm just going to make this a lighter color for now, just that it's easier for you to see what I'm doing. So I'm going to make this a light blue for now. Okay, so now I want to cut little circles or little holes out of the top of each pennant. So that way I can thread a piece of twine through to string it like a pennant. So to do that, I'm just going to move my white background out of the way for a second so it's easier to see. Okay, so we have my blue pennant. I'm going to go over to Shapes and select Circle. It's going to give me a really large circle, which I'm going to shrink down to the size that I want and the place that I want it. And then I'm going to duplicate that so that way the two holes are symmetrical. Okay, now in order for it to actually cut the circle out, you need to select the circle, hit Shift and select the pennant. Then go down here and click Slice. When you do that and then drag the pennant, you'll see it has now cut the hole out of the pennant. So now I'm going to delete that part of the circle. And now I'm going to repeat the process. I'm just going to send this back for a second. So that way when I drag this up, and again, I want the hole to line up with the other hole. So that looks good. So I'm going to click the circle, Shift, select the pennant, slice, drag it down, and then delete what's left of the hole. And now we have the pennant. Now I can drag my background back up. Now I need 5 of these pennants because the baby's name has 5 letters. So now I'm going to right click the pennant, duplicate, 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 and duplicate. So there's my 5 different pennants for the 5 letters of his name. Okay. So now I want to insert a text box onto each pennant. So that way I can put the letters of his name. First letter is P. Bring it up here. That font looks to be about the right size. Good. Insert another text box for E. There we go. Text box T. Text box E. And text box R. Now, if I want to drag this around in my design, I can join the two objects together. So for instance, with the R, I can select, whoops, there we go. And now if I want to attach these two things together, I can select the pennant, Oops, let's actually select the letter first. Select the letter, also select the pennant, and then flatten those together. So that way I can drag it around my canvas here without losing anything, and I can repeat that process with the other ones to flatten those. When you flatten it, you lose that little outline, but that's okay because I don't want my finished product to have a black outline anyway, so that's really not necessary. Flatten. Okay. Now, in terms of the color of the letters, again, I can figure out if I want to print that in a different color, but for now, it's fine that it's showing up in black. Okay, now I want to see my whole canvas again, just so I can arrange everything here. Okay, so if I move my clouds down, I think I can actually make my balloon a little bigger. Let's see if I make it like 5.55. There we go. Okay, so now if I'm arranging my letters like so, in like a swag formation, imagine that there's the twine, the baker's twine running through here. I want to then hide my twine behind this white mat. So I also want to make little holes at the top corners to thread my twine through. So I'm going to repeat that process with the circle. So again, I'm going to Shapes, Circle, shrink it down. And I want to put it probably about 3/4 in from the left and about 1/2 inch down on the right, like so. Shrink it down a little bit. Okay, and then I'm going to duplicate that hole to also put one over here. So again, about 3/4 inches from the right side and about 1/2 inch down. Okay, like so. This one actually looks like it can come down a little bit. Okay, now I'm going to repeat the process to slice that out of the white part. So my circle's highlighted. I'm going to hit Shift to also select the white square. Click Slice. Now if I drag this down, I can get rid of that original part. Left click to send this all the way to the back, since that's the very back of my project. Okay, and again, make sure this looks even. Good, so I'm going to select my circle, Shift select the square, click Slice. Drag this down, and then get rid of the remnants of that. Right click, send that to the back. Oops. Bring that back up, bring my balloon back down. Alrighty. Now, when I print this out, it's okay that things are not perfectly centered on here because I'm going to be able to do that manually as I assemble everything together. So for now, this is fine. So now I'm going to save my project. Let's call this one Peter Birth Announcement. Save. Now I want to make this on my Cricut, so I'm going over here to make it. Now right now it's showing the letters of Peter are print then cut, and I don't want that, so I'm going to go back here. Let's see. I'm going to unflatten this for a second. Let's see what's going on here. Ah, I see, because that showed up as a print, so I'm going to say no fill for this. So for some reason, it was seeing my letter as a printed letter as opposed to a cutout letter. And I definitely want the letters, these big bold letters, to be cut out. Unflatten. No fill. Unflatten. No fill. Okay, and then same thing on all of my pennants, change that to no fill for now. It's okay that it's changing it to that pink color. Oops, didn't mean to do that. That it's changing it to the pink color because I'm going to change that in a second. No fill. No fill. No fill. Okay, so now in terms of the color of these, let's choose that shade of blue. How about that one? Okay, so for each of the pennants, I'll go with that shade of blue. And again, this is just to conserve some paper because it can choose something that's already in the design of the hot air balloon, and that way it can cut it all out on one sheet of cardstock as opposed to having to feed yet another color into the Cricut machine. There we go. Okay, save it again. Save. Alrighty. And now we're going to go to make it. Now it's still showing the blue is also going to print then cut, and I don't want this to print all in one layer. So I'm going to cancel. Let's go back over here to my cloud. We're going to detach them now. Same thing over here. Detach them. Now let's see what happens if we go to make it. Okay, good. That's how I wanted it. So now don't get nervous that the outline of the cloud is not printed here. It's just because the cloud is white and the paper is white. So that looks fine. It's going to print out as 8.5 by 11 on my laser printer. If I go down to this one, this is going to be a 12-inch by 12-inch piece of cardstock, which is fine because since this is wider than 8.5 inches, I can't use a typical 8.5 by 11 piece of cardstock. If I scroll down, okay, this top layer of the balloon, this is showing as white, but I could use any color I want. But I have 8.5 by 11 cardstock for that, so I'm going to change that to 8.5 by 11. Okay, these are the letters of Peter's name. Again, it doesn't necessarily have to be in black. I could choose whatever color I want, but I'm going to use an 8.5 by 11 piece for that. This one's going to be 8.5 by 11. Basically, all of the blue layers are 8.5 by 11, and you can see it rearranged it so that it fits onto one 8.5 by 11 sheet, so you're not wasting paper. Okay, a couple more. 8.5 by 11. And you could play around with the colors of the layers to conserve even more. Okay, there you go. So now I have all of my layers set up for 8.5 by 11 with the exception of the one big white square, which is going to be on a 12 by 12. And then I would click continue and follow the on-screen instructions from there. Right now I don't have my Cricut turned on, but if it was on, I would then select that device and follow the on-screen directions for the next step. So when I first printed out what's going to be the little white clouds, I got a little bit nervous because I don't actually see the outline of the cloud on here, but you're going to see that when it cuts it, it will cut out the cloud. So this first step was done as a print then cut because I wanted the baby's statistics to already be printed on the cloud rather than having to individually glue every single letter and number onto the cloud. So this is the only part of the project that's print then cut. Everything else is just a cut. So I'm going to put this on my mat. And again, I want to line it up approximately at one of the corners of the mat. Press it down so that there's no big gaps there. put it into the Cricut like so. I already told my computer that I'm printing this, so it's up to the step where it's telling me to hit the arrow button. And now it's telling me to click the Cricut button. Now, when you do a print then cut, it's going to first try to sense where this black outline is. So I know it's hard to see on the camera, but right now there's a little light bulb that's sensing all 4 edges of that black rectangle. Once it senses the 4 edges, it will start to cut out. So when you do a print then cut, it typically takes a little bit longer before it starts cutting because it is calibrating itself to make sure that it's cutting in exactly the right spot. Now on this one, it's not going to be as obvious if it was a little bit off because it's just a plain white cloud, but if you were doing a more intricate printed design, you definitely want it to be cutting it precisely. So you can see right now it is starting to cut out the cloud outline. Okay, now it's telling me that I can click on the arrow button to eject it from the machine. Now, when you remove something from the mat of your Cricut, you don't want to peel the paper up. Instead, you want to turn the mat over upside down, bend up the corner of your mat, and then it will release from the mat. Now, this one part of it's stuck on here, but that's easy. Just gently separate it out right there. Okay, and then for this one, again, you don't want to peel it up off the mat because then you're going to end up bending your cloud. So instead, bend the mat, and then the cloud just pops right off. Okay, so far I have my 2 little white clouds have been cut out. Now, if I go back over to my computer, it's telling me that the next mat it's ready for is the large white square, which is going to be my background. Now, this is the only mat that I set as a 12-inch by 12-inch cardstock because I needed to do wider than 8.5 by 11 since my square is going to be 8.75 by 8.75. So for this one sheet, I'm using a 12 by 12. So I'm going to put it right on the blue mat again. Again, I'm using that light blue mat for everything. Gently press it down, put it into the machine, click the arrow button, and then click the Cricut button. Now this is not a print then cut, this is just a cut, so it's going to start cutting a little bit sooner than it did on the other one. And typically for the intricate cardstock cuts, it does cut everything twice. I know that the dial has the option that you could set it for cardstock, but I've had better luck by setting everything on custom, and then on the actual computer, I'll set it for the custom cardstock. Okay, it's telling me to hit the arrow button. And again, I'm going to turn this upside down to gently get the pages off of the mat. As you can see, it's been cut out. And now I have my perfectly cut square. So I'm going to keep this in a safe place until I'm ready to use it. And now we're up to the next sheet, which is going to be the lightest shade of blue. Now, you'll notice that the sheet I'm using, I'd done kind of a demo cut over here. And I saw that it was a little bit smaller than I wanted it, so I actually decided to make it bigger. Rather than use a whole new sheet of cardstock, I can reuse the sheet because all I need is a spot that's big enough to fit my new image, which is perfect right here. So I'm going to put it on my mat. Gently press it down. Put it into the Cricut. Just make sure that you're getting your mat underneath these little guides on the side, because if not, trust me, you're not going to get a clean cut. Then click the arrow, click the Cricut button, and away we go. Now this lightest blue is the laciest layer, so to speak. It's very, very thin cuts. So it is going to do a very delicate cut throughout this top image. So when I take this one off the mat, I want to be super careful. And again, it's going to trace over each line twice to get a good clean cut. And what I like about using the prepackaged sets of ombre shades of blue is that all the shades of blue are coordinated with each other. It kind of takes the guesswork if you're doing one of these layered 3D effect designs, so that way you're not getting clashing colors of blue. However, it only came with 5 colors of blue in the pack, so I did have to choose 2 shades of blue from other packs that I had. So this particular one, this lightest blue one, comes from a different pack that happened to have a slightly lighter shade of blue in it. So now it's cutting out the little basket part of the hot air balloon. The more intricate your design, the longer it will take to cut out. You know, I've cut out some very intricate designs that could take, you know, more than 10 minutes just to cut out one sheet. So typically I like to have other things going on that I can multitask as I am cutting out some of my designs. It's retracing over the outline now. Now you'll see it's doing the second pass over all of those cuts. Okay, so now it's telling me my arrow button is blinking, which means it's ready to eject. And again, I want to turn the mat upside down, bend the mat backwards. And now because this is a very lacy cut, I am going to use my scraper. And I'm going to use my scraper to hold down my design. So that way, as I'm peeling it up, I'm not bending or warping that paper. Because when it comes time to laying out this particular project, I don't want a bent project. Now you'll see on my mat, I'm left with these little itty bitty scraps. Obviously, that's not part of my design. If I lift this part up, you will now see that we have a beautiful top layer. One little part got stuck there. There we go. And this is the top layer of our hot air balloon. I'm going to continue this process now with the remaining layers of the project, and then I'll join back with you to show you how to assemble it. Okay, so now I'm going to show you how to assemble your 3D picture now that everything's been cut out on the Cricut. So for this step of the process, I pretty much put together all of the supplies that I could possibly need depending on what happens during this assembly process. So I have all of my cut out pieces. Nothing is glued together yet, so I just kind of generally laid them out just to make sure that I had everything. I have adhesive foam squares. These I had purchased at Michael's. It comes in a pack with 350 little squares in it. They're 2 different sizes. So we have the smaller ones are 1/4 of an inch square. There's 280 of these, and then there's 70 of the 1/2 inch ones. I don't think I'm going to use many or any of the 1/2 inch ones, but I'll definitely be using the smaller ones. For glue, I'm using Aleene's Clear Gel Tacky Glue. However, I have put it into one of these very fine tipped glue containers. This is because a lot of what I'm going to be gluing is on very, very thin strips of paper. So I want a very thin bead of glue. So I have this here, just in case I have a glue stick, in case I want to use that. I have some toothpicks. So if I need to spread the glue, this might be easier to spread it with. I have my Cricut weeding tool. So if I notice that there's any little pieces still stuck in between that I need to get out, I can poke those out. I have my regular scissors. And because I'm going to be making a little bit of a pennant banner on the top, I also have some blue and white twine. So we have all of our supplies that we need. And I've just lined my craft table with a piece of wax paper so nothing gets stuck to it, especially since we're using glue. Some people have recommended using spray adhesive for these very thin layers. I've never had a whole lot of luck with spray adhesive because what usually ends up happening is even though you spray it on one side, some of it transfers to the other side and then it dries and it's darker on that spot. So rather than ruining all this hard work, I figured I am just going to use the tacky glue and the foam squares for the thicker pieces. So to get started, let's start with the easy parts. So for my clouds, for the clouds, we have the white part and the blue part. So for this, since they're nice big pieces, I can use one of the squares. So what you do is you just remove a square from its backing. You're gonna put it on the back of your top piece as opposed to putting it on the front of your bottom piece, if that makes sense. Because what happens is if your top piece is smaller than your bottom piece, if you are not quite sure of exactly where they will overlap, you're going to be putting it in a spot that could potentially show. So we don't want that. So I put the two pieces on, then you peel off the backing. It comes off pretty easily. And then we're going to center it as best we can over the blue underpiece. And there we now have our layered cloud. So there is, a little bit of separation between the two. So that's what makes a 3D cloud. For the letters of his name, I chose a pretty thick font. So before I go too much further, I can see that the squares are pretty much exactly the same width as the letter. And then there's a chance that they're going to show. So instead, you might have to pre-cut some of the squares in half. I kind of had that done over here, but it's been a while since I cut them. So I'm just gonna cut them through again, just in case. So again, I'm just doing this to make skinnier squares, and they cut very easily because it's just a nice soft foam. So that way you don't have to worry about any of the white foam sticking out between the layers. Because again, after you put in all this time and creativity to make your design, you don't want it to be ruined by visible foam squares. Okay, so I'm going to take a couple pieces to put it on the back. And again, just make sure you're putting it on the back. Sometimes in our excitement to get this done, you might rush a little bit and accidentally stick it on the front, especially if a letter looks very similar front and back. And you don't have to cover the entire back with this. I mean, it's just a very tiny sheet of paper. It's not like it's a heavy object that's going to weight down when it gets stuck on top. Okay, and again, I want to try and center it as best I can. There we go. And so here we have P for Peter. And I don't know if you could see on there that it definitely has some space in between. So again, that would be an example of how to do a letter. Now for the actual mandala part, or mandala part, this is a 7-layer project. The bottom layer is pretty much solid. And then each successive layer is more of a lacy layer. This took quite a bit of time to weed, and by weeding it means poking out any of the little pieces in between. When I used my spatula to take this off of my Cricut mat, most of the little pieces did come out. But the very, very tiny pieces, they're gonna cling for dear life. So I had to use my Cricut weeding tool, which is kind of like a dental pick. If you don't have a Cricut weeding tool, you can probably use a toothpick, or you can even get a very inexpensive tool set at Harbor Freight. It's, I think, $5 or even less than $5, where you get like 5 of these of all different angles. So if you don't want to pay full price for the Cricut one, or you can't find a Cricut one in stock in your local store, just go to Harbor Freight and get one of their little pick sets. And again, because this was such a little lacy project, there's lots of little paper pieces that kind of got stuck there. The good news is, because this layer happens to be towards the bottom, it's going to be covered by a lot of the other layers. So if there is a stray piece of paper here and there, it won't be as noticeable because it will be camouflaged. Okay, so I'm going to start with these bottom 2 layers. Now, as I mentioned, if I try to use the foam squares on something this lacy, even if I tried to cut the foam squares in teeny tiny pieces, it would show, especially since I'm using these dark blues. Perhaps if I were doing something that was all white, it wouldn't really show up, but because I'm using the dark blue, it would definitely show up. So I'm not going to use the foam squares for this particular part of the project. I'm just going to move this out of the way. So instead, I am going to use my tacky glue. Now I want to see, thankfully this was a symmetrical project, meaning that the left side and the right side are identical. So I'm going to look and see which side of this looks neatest, and that would be my top side. So this looks like it's the neater side. Okay, so I don't want to put the glue on here, because then you're going to have glue oozing up through the little holes in the design. So instead, I want to put the glue on the reverse side of this, and then take it and flip it and sandwich it on like so. So to do this, again, I'm going to flip over to the least pretty side, pull out the pin from the applicator, and I'm going to try and put this wherever the lines are thickest, just because it'll be easier in terms of not having it ooze out or as visible, just in case some of it does become visible. So I'm just going to squeeze this a little bit to get this started. Yeah, let's just see here if I can get this started. Now this comes out in an extremely fine dot, which is great in terms of being able to control where it goes, but it does require some patience because it's not going to come out in like this even bead of glue. So I'm just going to put this in a few strategic spots. And again, I'm aiming for the spots that are slightly thicker. I'm not going to put it on any place that's too thin, because that will definitely cause a problem when it oozes out. Now, you might be thinking, well, won't this lose the 3D effect because you're not using the 3D foam dots in between each layer? Since this is a 7-layer project, it actually is pretty thick even without foam dots. So by doing it this way, yes, it's true, it's not going to have as much dimension, but with 7 layers, if you're putting those foam squares in between each layer, this would be very, very thick, almost distractingly thick. So I think that in this case, the glue is actually a very good compromise because it won't be as thick and unwieldy to mount inside the frame. So again, I'm just going back over and seeing if there's any other areas that are slightly thicker that I can add a little bit more glue to. There we go. And again, this is going to be sandwiched under several layers, so you don't have to cover every little millimeter of cardstock with glue. Okay, so now we have it on the back, so I'm going to take my bottom layer, flip this layer over. Now it's actually easier to line it up using the basket of this design because every layer has something in the basket layer, so in the basket area, I should say. So that's going to help me to sandwich it on. Now I realize this one's kind of hard to see because they're very, very similar shades of blue, but here we have this. It's nice and sandwiched on. I'll just press it down gently. And as I'm pressing it, I'm not feeling any glue ooze through, which is wonderful because that was my concern, was I didn't want any liquid glue oozing up because that would discolor the cardstock. And if that doesn't end up getting covered by one of the layers that goes on top of it, that would not look beautiful. Okay, so that layer's done. Now we're going to take our next layer. And again, same thing. You want to look it over first, make sure that all of those little spare pieces of paper have been poked out using my little poking tool here. Kind of reminds me of a dental tool. Okay, and again, if there's any other tiny little pieces of paper in between, they won't be noticed too much because this is one of the under layers of the project. Okay, so I'm just gonna look at both sides now to pick which one's prettier. Let's see, okay, I'm gonna use this one as the glue layer. Okay, so again, I'm going to take my little glue applicator, squeeze it a little bit to get the glue flowing here. And again, I've tried spray adhesives on very skinny projects before, thinking that that would be a great solution, and it ended up discoloring the paper. The overspray ended up getting all over my dining room table, despite the fact that I had put down newspapers. Apparently the overspray goes much further than you might think. So it definitely is a mess. So if you are going to use adhesive spray, I would definitely recommend putting a drop cloth down, not just a newspaper. Drop cloth your entire tabletop. If you do it outside, I mean, yes, that might be a good solution. However, because these pieces are so lightweight, my concern would be that you'd be chasing them around your yard as they would fly away in the breeze. So this is definitely a little bit easier to maneuver when you're indoors and you don't have to worry about a breeze. Okay, and then over here I can add a little bit more because this is a solid part. And again, this part where the basket of the balloon is more solid on all of my layers, with the exception of maybe the top 2 layers. So this can definitely be a little bit more glue down here. Okay. So now again, just to make it easier, I'm just going to turn this sideways. Pick this up. Use the basket as my guide to sandwich this on. Beautiful. Okay, so now we have 3 layers on. Next up, this is kind of like a lavendery blue. So again, I'm going to look to see which side looks neater, and I'm going to use the messier side as the side I'm going to put the glue on. And again, I love the fact that this is a symmetrical design because it does make it more flexible in terms of potentially flipping it over and using the back if there is any type of defect on the front. Because even as I was cutting this particular layer out, I noticed that the piece of cardstock that it was on had a slight dark spot on it, I guess from the paper making process when they made it in the factory. And so I was hoping that as it was cutting, that particular part of the piece of cardstock would end up being cut away, and luckily it was. But if it hadn't been cut away, if that imperfection was only on one side of the cardstock, I would have been able to simply flip it over, and the side that would be facing out could be the side that didn't have the imperfection. And again, a little bit of glue down here. Okay, slide this over. Sandwich it on. Okay, press down. Again, I'm not feeling any liquid glue coming up because I use my glue very sparingly. and it's starting to take shape now. So even though we have 4 layers so far, you can already see it has a depth to it. It's not looking flat, even though it's made so far of 4 flat sheets of cardstock. Okay, now we have this slightly lighter lavendery blue. Let's see, I'm going to use this as my gluing side. Takes a while for the glue to make its way back to the nozzle. And again, because this is such a fine point applicator on this particular bottle, I don't have to be super duper steady with my hand as I do this, whereas if I use the original container it came in, that would have had a bead of glue that would have been wider than everything on this particular balloon. So that would have been a hot mess. Speaking of hot mess, I would not use a glue gun for this process because again, a glue gun makes a very wide dot no matter how fine you try to do it. Now this time the basket part is no longer solid anymore. Now it's more of this grid effect. So I do have to be a little bit more careful here. But I definitely want to put some glue down here because gravity over time, since this is going to be hanging on a wall, I want to make sure that the layers don't pull apart with gravity. So I definitely want some extra glue down there, and I'll put some glue along the top edge as well. But a little tiny bit of glue maybe on the left and right side, even though I don't really think it's needed too much there, but we'll put it there just as our security policy. Okay, take it, flip it. And then starting with the basket area. Yeah, you don't just want to like plop this down because it does have the wet glue on it, and you don't want to get wet glue on a part of your design that then you're going to move your glue around because then that wet glue will permanently darken the layer underneath. So we're just very gently pressing down. Okay, so there we have 5 layers. It's looking beautiful already. But why stop at 5 when you can go to 7, right? Okay, so again, checking this out, which is the prettier side. Let's see, okay, in this case, we're gonna take the least pretty side, or less pretty side, I guess I should say. And put this glue here. Now, it's funny because when I first saw this design, I'm thinking, well, my great nephew's room has a transportation theme, and you know, here he is, a kid born in the 21st century. It's not like people use hot air balloons as a means of travel anymore. So will he actually know what a hot air balloon is? And then I thought back a couple years ago at my school, we had an assembly where they brought a full-size hot air balloon to our school. And it was really a fascinating assembly just to see how large these balloons are up close. Unfortunately, the weather was not cooperating that day, so they couldn't inflate the balloon outside. But what they did is they brought the whole actual balloon into our school gym, and they had all of the 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade classes and staff sit inside the balloon, not inside the basket, inside the balloon. And that's, I would say, easily 250 people fit inside the balloon. So it's incredible to see just how huge these balloons are in real life. And then they took us outside where they had the basket set up just to show the kids how they use the flame to maneuver the basket around, even though they didn't have the balloon attached to it. So that was pretty neat. That was one of the coolest assemblies that we ever had. So definitely worthwhile to check that out in your area. I think it was Remax Real Estate had this. It's like their community service project that they do assemblies with their balloons. That's pretty neat. Okay, so now we're flipping this guy over, and again, it gets a little bit tricky as we're getting thinner and thinner and more delicate. There's not a whole lot to grab as you're trying to maneuver this. Okay, looking really, really nice here. Beautiful. And we have our one last top layer, which this one really doesn't have any lace on it. It's just the rounded curves here of the balloon. So I'll put a little bit at the middle of each spoke, so to speak. Now, to be honest with you, this is easier to assemble than I thought. I honestly thought that, lining up the layers would be tricky, or getting the glue to only go on the cardstock and not ooze out was going to be tricky. And who knows, maybe I'm jinxing myself by saying that right now, but it actually has been assembling fairly easily. Again, we're going to line up the basket area first, and then use that as our guide to press down the other layers. Okay, so there you have it. So 7 layers. You definitely have depth, even though the layers are sandwiched right on top of each other with no spacers. In terms of thickness, I don't know if you're able to see this, but obviously it's 7 layers of paper put together, so it's got some heft to it. It's got some substance to it. So that is our balloon. So what I'll do, I'm going to finish gluing the other pieces together, and then I'll show you how we're going to make our pennant and how we're going to glue everything together at the end. So we have all of our pieces of our project either glued together in the case of the balloon, or using the foam core squares, adhesive squares for the clouds and the name. But now what I want to do is I want to turn the pennant into a pennant on a string. So I'm going to take my twine, and I'm going to cut off a piece that's longer than I'll actually need for now. And I'm also going to make a fresh cut on the original end, because it'll just be easier to thread through the little holes. And when I cut out this particular part of the project on the Cricut, I did have the holes cut by the Cricut rather than attempting to poke these myself. Originally, the pennant design that I had little slits, but I guess because I had shrunk the pennant flags down so much, the slits were like microscopic. I definitely wouldn't have been able to fit this through without ripping. So I redid it where I had the holes big enough. So I want the twine to show on the front of each part of the pennant. So I started on the back, wove it to the front, starting with the letter P. I'm going to do the same thing with each letter. And again, make sure you're spelling the name correctly as you go, not that you accidentally put these letters in the wrong order, because sometimes after looking at your project for so long, you don't even realize that you have things out of order. So kind of like how carpenters say to measure twice and cut once. As crafters, we need to check our work as well. And again, you don't want to pull too hard, because these holes are very close to the corners. You don't want to rip your pennant as you're doing this. And thankfully, Peter's name is fairly short. If you're doing this for a child that has a longer name, obviously you're either going to have to use a larger frame, or you might just want to glue these down. Now see, it's starting to fray a little bit, so I'm going to chop off the end. That's why I made sure my twine was a little bit longer than I needed at the beginning, so that way it can withstand some haircuts, so to speak. Now I like to pick up these different colors of twine whenever I see them. This one I think I picked up at that store called Tuesday Morning, which you never quite know what they're going to have at that store. I think they get things like as they go out of out of stock at other stores, not necessarily out of stock, but like as they stop carrying certain items, they sell it to Tuesday morning, and then Tuesday morning has like random things. But in their craft section, they usually have a pretty good selection of bakery twine. And that's what this is technically called. I'm gonna trim this again, it's got a little bit frayed again. Also, at like the after Christmas sales, you can usually find this in the gift wrap department. At Christmas time, usually it's the red and white and green and white ones, but it's always good to pick those up when they're on clearance because I love a deal. I never pay full price for something. I am definitely the person that goes to every store with the coupons and coupon apps and shopper reward cards. So you can definitely get these for a good price. Okay. So now I have the name strung onto here. Now, when I envisioned this, I wanted it to kind of drape over the balloon so that the center letter would be lower than the other letters. I'm just gonna kind of zhuzh these around a little bit to get them to where I like them. And it's nice that his name has an odd number of letters because then we can easily see that the T needs to be in the center. Okay, this looks pretty good. Now you'll notice that on the backing paper that I cut, I also had 2 little holes cut out of that using my Cricut. So that way I can tuck the twine behind here instead of having to figure out how to glue the twine onto the front of this board. So I am going to thread my 2 ends through. There we go. And again, I can kind of zhuzh this around a little bit. And then if I want to, I can put the foam pieces underneath each one of these to make it stand out from the background a little bit. So I don't want to pull my twine perfectly tight yet until I'm totally happy with that. I also want to make sure that it leaves me room to put the rest of my components on here. And remember that when you put this into the frame will cover the edges of your backing paper. So you don't want to have your design go all the way to the very edge because then it will get covered by the frame. So I want to make sure that all of my components are far enough away from the edges so that way it does not interfere with the frame. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with how this looks. So now before I mount those, I'm actually going to mount my balloon. Now just to be sure to center it, I'm going to get out my ruler here. So my square is 8 3/4. So that means that the center, well, let's see, well, 8 1/2, half of that would have been 4 1/4. So this is going to be slightly more than 4 1/4. So right here is going to be the center. So I like where this is right now. This is the perfect spot for it. So I'm going to flip my balloon over for a second. I'm going to put some adhesive squares, and now I can actually use the larger squares on this one. Let's see, that should fit on here. Good, then peel off the backing. There we go. Center it where I want it. And then gently press. Beautiful. Now for my clouds, I can decide, do I want my clouds tilted? Do I want my clouds straight? I happen to like the way they look straight. So I'm going to put a piece on the back of these. And again, they're not that heavy. You don't have to put multiple foam squares on these. can kind of reposition these before you press them down. So if you think that they're too high, too low, too far to the left, too far to the right, before you press down, just kind of make sure you're happy with them. And then press. Okay, so now I have to decide with the banner, do I want the foam piece or not? I'll try it with one to see how I like it. And if I don't like it, I can always peel the foam piece off, because before you press down too hard, these are pretty easy to peel off. I'm going to put it here. Let's see what it looks like. Yeah, I like the way that looks when it's up off of the backing. Let's turn all these guys over. Again, the trick with these foam core pieces is don't put them too close to the edge, so that way they will not show when you are mounting these. I mean, typically if you're putting this in a shadow box frame anyway, it's not like somebody's gonna come and be able to see what you put on the side. There are shadow box frames that have like a clear side to them, so whoops, that way you can see what's going on inside that depth of the frame, but the frame I'm using is solid on the side. Okay, so again, my goal is to have the T be right above the center of the balloon. And then that means the letters to either side of it would be slightly above, so I can use that as my guide. Before I move them down, I'm sliding them along the twine, so that way the letters look relatively evenly spaced. Beautiful. And there we have it. So if I tuck the twine in, we now have our completed projects. All that's left to do is to put it in the frame. I am going to secure the twine on the back with some tape. I'll trim it down a little bit, and then it'll be ready to be framed. So I hope that you've enjoyed this video. If you have any information about any of the products that I've used, I'll put them in the blog posting as well as beneath this video. And I hope to see you again for my next video. Thanks for joining me.